welcome to today's episode of Coffee Break. And today my special guest is Jan. And our special topic is WILPF, which is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So Jan, can you tell the audience what is WILPF, please?
Yes, WILPF was actually established in 1920, and my grandmother's best friend, Elenor Moore, was the delegate who went to Geneva for that first International Women's Peace Conference.
Okay.
What is interesting is, and I'd like to quote, Miss Elenor Moore, who represented the Sisterhood of Peace at the Congress held in, not Geneva, in Zurich, in May 1919, returned to Melbourne and reported the following. She explained that a permanent bureau, to be known as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, had been established in Geneva. The object of the Bureau was to foster a better understanding between the nations and to repudiate war as a means of settling international differences.
Okay.
To work for the abolition of conscription in all countries, to work for the nationalisation of the manufacture of armaments as a step towards the complete abolition of them, and to try to train children to regard other countries as people with which to cooperate and to endeavour to improve the political, economic and social status of women.
Okay.
What an aim.
I know the aim hasn't changed, but it's very interesting. In 2015, there's a big focus on the masculine war effort. But all the time, every time there's a war, there is a resistance movement. And Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I see over the century as being the resistance. They did protest. In fact, in 1915, I'm not too sure whether it was before the carnage in Gallipoli or shortly after, women from countries all around Europe, countries that were at war with each other, and I don't know how they managed to arrive, but they went to The Hague and they protested. They said, you must stop this senseless carnage. You must stop this stupidity. And of course, no one listened to them. But from that initial protest, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom evolved. Now, you're a member of WILPF, aren't you? And so have I. I've been a member for nearly 20 years. And the thing I love about WILPF is the gentleness, the gentle energy. It's quite delightful.
It's quite interesting that Mabel and Elenor Moore founded the Sisterhood of International Peace. Vida Goldstein, a very feisty and well-educated and wonderful woman, founded the Women's Peace Army. Now, it was interesting that both of those organisations had a common aim, which was to stop the war. But they went about it in completely different ways. The Sisterhood, which became the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, actually went to middle-class drawing rooms, gave lectures, spoke in factories. But the Women's Peace Army had massive, wonderful, feisty demonstrations. And one of the most famous was at the second anti-conscription movement in 1917. They applied to have a march along Swanston Street in Melbourne. It was refused. So what they did, they said, fine, we won't march, we'll go another way. So they were led by Celia John on a white horse, and every single woman either rode a bicycle or stood on the running boards of cars, anything except place their feet on the pavement, and of course the police were helpless to do anything about it.
Oh, don't you love them? It's women's creative way of working around an
Getting
obstacle.
around, yes.
Yep.
This is Mabel, my grandmother, and I am reasonably convinced that this was her wedding dress. She had become quite a remarkable young woman by the age of 20, because in 1900 she actually entered an elocution competition at the Royal Exhibition Buildings in Melbourne, and she won 4 gold medals for recitation, including Alfred Deacon's Federation speech. And she was the only woman in 3 of the 4 categories who entered. She won all four gold medals. And I found an envelope in her archives that said, won 4 gold medals, took the money instead, and bought my wedding dress. She then ran away to Charters Towers and married the love of her life, and she married, in fact, the secretary of the Stock Exchange at Charters Towers. Mabel, who had matriculated at Presbyterian Ladies' College with honours in English, when she went to Charters Towers, she immediately formed a Shakespeare club and had 2 children. Tragically, in 1903, her husband, who was considerably older than she was, died of a massive heart attack, and she was left a widow at a very young age. That is the little gorgeous little thing with her hair brushed up in the most bizarre way is my mother, Cecily.
So your talk centres around Mabel's work as a peacemaker. And Mabel was motivated to do this because of the experience of her brother in Europe.
Partly. Dr. Charles Strong of the Australian Church, which was a breakaway from the Presbyterian Church, was located in Russell Street in Melbourne, and he had started the whole peace movement in 1905. In 1915, he decided that the women had to do something, and he suggested that they founded the Sisterhood, and that was Mabel and Elenor Moore.
So that was the precursor of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
As far as Australian representatives were concerned, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And Sisters of Peace morphed into WILPF?
Yes, that's exactly right. So that the Sisterhood of International Peace existed for 5 years until 1920, when they became the Melbourne branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, headed by Elenor Moore, with Mabel as secretary.
Thank you.
Elenor Moore was my grandmother Mabel's best friend. She went to PLC as well, and she was the editor of the school magazine. They were inseparable friends throughout their entire lives, and both of them were the correspondence secretaries when the Sisterhood of International Peace was formed on the 25th of March 1915. This is another remarkable old collegian, a student who also went to Presbyterian Ladies' College in East Melbourne, along with Elenor Moore and my grandmother Mabel. They became good friends, although Vida was a little bit older than Mabel and Elenor, and she, of course, founded the Women's Peace Army. But as well as that, she was the very first woman to ever stand for Parliament in the British Empire. And one of her remarkable policy statements was that she wanted to change the age of consent for marriage, which at the time in 1919 was unbelievably 12 for girls and 14 for boys. She wanted to increase that age 4 or 5 years. An extraordinary fact that I did not know. Of course, Vida was active, along with Adela Pankhurst, in the suffragette movement in Australia. And as a result, when she was old enough and ready, she decided that she would actually put the fact that there were votes for women into practice and stood for Parliament herself. Unfortunately, she was never elected, which I think was a great shame, but Vida was very well known in Melbourne during the early 20th century. She's a great woman, and you can see how powerful she is from the photograph. This is my favourite photograph of my grandmother. I don't think I was born when this photograph was taken, but I just love the smile and the really strong facial features to me. She is somebody who knows where she's going, she's facing the camera, and she's saying, I'm okay. What I remember of my grandmother is the next photograph, which I remember her better. And one of the things I loved to do when I visited her was to unpin that mass of wonderful white hair and brush it and plait it. It was like gossamer, and it used to fly up under the brush. While I was brushing her hair, we would talk about Shakespeare's plays, we would talk about politics, we would talk about my next birthday party, because Mabel was interested in everything. She would hold luncheon parties every Thursday, and I can remember Esperanto language around the table. I can remember vehement political arguments going on, but I, as a little girl, was allowed to lift the lid of the window seat at the end of the table while the conversations were going on, and it was there that I found Tom's letters to his sister and all Mabel's diaries and cuttings from 1913 right up until her death in 1968. Mabel's little brother Tom was one of the first 500 to enlist in September 1914. This is an extraordinary photograph, in my opinion, because Tom was about 10 at the time. He seems to be in a military uniform, but what I love best is his dog is beside him, and his name is Nipper. What I found interesting about this photograph, and I was a little bit shocked, is that he is actually in a cadet uniform. I've tried to trace the school. I can't find any evidence of him in any of the schools in Melbourne. I'm not sure where he went to school. Well, this little boy, Tom, who we saw with his dog Nipper, has now grown up into an adult, and he is actually 32 years old. Tom was in the first 551, or he was actually number 551 when he enlisted. And it's interesting that the uniform he's wearing was the very uniform given to the very, very first recruits. Later, they wore the slouch hats, but initially they had those rather strange little peaked things, which I find quite interesting. But this is at the Broadmeadows camp, and Tom was there for about 2 months. Tom left on one of 32 troop ships on the 1st of November 1914, bound for Egypt, where he thought there might be 3 or 4 months where he would have a lot of fun, see the pyramids, and would be home by Christmas. Of course, it turned into a truly obscene 4 years.
How did you come to be so passionate about your grandmother's story?
Well, on Friday I'm giving a lecture called The Pacifist and the Soldier. And it was when I discovered my grandmother's diaries and the most extraordinary collection of letters that her little brother had sent my grandmother over the 4 years of World War I, explaining his experiences, and it actually records the happiness and excitement of a young man off on an adventure to the desperation of a man who writes, "My nerves are all rotten little ends," and who was discharged suffering from what was called shell shock at the end of the war. I wrote a book in 1986 called Six Bob a Day Tourist because I was devastated by the degeneration of this intelligent man writing about an event in history that actually destroyed him. And I feel even more strongly today because I believe that young men coming back from Iran and Afghanistan are suffering post-traumatic stress in exactly the same way as Tom did 100 years ago. And to me, one of the most shocking statistics that I read in the newspaper today, 2015,
Yes.
April the 8th, that more than 100 returned soldiers have committed suicide since 2000. Now that is a shocking, obscene statistic that makes it very clear that these young men are not being treated correctly when they return to civilian life. Tom also was not treated correctly, I believe, because 3 weeks after the armistice was declared, he was in Kerrang in Victoria looking for work. He'd been drinking heavily since he was discharged, and his sister was horrified by the change in him. But he went for a swim in a lake, and I went up to the very lake, to the very spot where he was found, and I found that the lake itself is very milky. So he went for a swim. He was absolutely sober. The coroner's report stated that. And he just disappeared. And it took his friends nearly 15 minutes to find his body. When they brought him out of the water, of course, he could not be resuscitated. But he had suffered not only neurologically and emotionally, but he'd also had 2 massive bouts of rheumatic fever, and it was thought that his heart had been so weakened that he simply collapsed from a massive heart attack. So it was a pretty hard time for those returned soldiers.
Yeah. I don't think it's normal or natural for people to kill other people.
This photograph I'm very proud of. My grandmother and her second husband, Will Drummond, were the Australian delegates to an international Esperanto conference in Europe in 1923. Will was a great advocate of the Esperanto language, which of course is an international language with very simple grammar and which was invented to promote international relations between individuals who spoke different languages. It was meant to become a common international language so that peace and politics could be negotiated mutually without having the real barrier of individual languages. Mabel is in the centre and her husband Will is on the right. The reason that I'm going to be talking on Friday about Mabel as a person is that I really am interested in conveying to the audience the kinds of personalities of these women. I admire them so much and try to live up to my grandmother's strength.
You actually have the original handwritten letters.
Only some of them, because Mabel also typed them all up very carefully, obviously worried that they were going to disintegrate and whatever. But there were a couple of handwritten letters with that extraordinary purple indelible pencil that all the soldiers were given, so that when they wrote, even if the letters got wet, the indelible purple pencil would remain. The thing that's very interesting in all the research that I've done over the years is the great tragedy of those young men coming back. When I was asked to go to Albany in Western Australia for the opening of the National Anzac Centre, where Tom is one of the featured characters in that extraordinarily good centre, where you can go online, just nationalanzaccentre.com.au, and you touch the screen and you can choose a story of one of 32 soldiers. And there was a radio program where I had been interviewed in the morning of that opening. What I found extraordinary was that people were asked to write in or ring up and talk about saying goodbye to people going off to war and how they felt about it. It was unanimous, the phone calls, where not a single caller glamorized war, glorified war. All of them talked about the sadness of the change in their men when they came back. My dad used to be really friendly. When he came back from the war, he used to beat me. My dad never drank before he went to the war. He became an alcoholic. My dad used to talk to me. Now he's silent. That was mostly post-World War II comments, but we have Vietnam, we have Iraq, we have Afghanistan, and I have to be honest, I agree with Jackie Lambie that our soldiers who've come back must be looked after well for post-traumatic stress, because I agree with you, Jan, it is not in man's nature to kill children, to kill civilians, whether it's on purpose or by accident, nor is it in men's psyche to actually kill another human being. And that's why war is obscene.
Currently in Canberra there's an exhibition called Women's Power to Stop War, and it's an exhibition of the work of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.